Yes, and also Aquinas' view of faith and reason was also significant. What was it? And it differed from the theological perspectives of his time, didn't it?
Absolutely. In many respects, yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that because that's another one of these that we could have said earlier when I was kind of going through a list. That was one that's important, and I shouldn't have left it out. And that is the relationship of faith and reason. It's even more telling today as a debate. And in my philosophy courses that I teach, we explore about a handful, five different views on the relationship of faith and reason. Of course, the atheists are just going to have this caricature that faith is just believing something you know isn't
Right.
true, kind of nonsense. We're like, well, there may be people that are that, but that's really not the Christian view.
Yes.
But then you have others where faith is like a pragmatism, what works in your life, what works for you. Um, but in Aquinas, and not just Aquinas, faith and reason boil down to this: that reason is believing something on the basis of demonstration, whatever that means, right? So if someone makes a claim, then if you believe that claim because you saw it demonstrated to be true, let's take, for example, my favorite example to give is Fermat's last theorem, the mathematician, the 17th century
Hmm.
mathematician Pierre de Fermat. And Fermat, he proposed all these mathematical theorems over his lifetime, and every one of them has been proven to be either true or false. Every one of them except one. And it's became known as Fermat's last theorem because no mathematician has been able to prove whether he's right or wrong or not. And it was for a long time the longest enduring math enigma. It finally got proven in the late 90s, in 1998, to be true
Hmm.
by Andrew Wiles at Princeton University. Now, the proof is like 111 pages in the Annals of Mathematics. Okay. So if somebody came along and said, it's Fermat's last theorem is true, and you say, and Andrew Wiles says yes, well, why does he believe it's true? He believes it's true because it's got the demonstration. He saw that it was true. So you could think different things can be demonstrated. If somebody said, well, Abraham Lincoln didn't have a beard. Well, what kind of question is that? Well, that's historical. That's not mathematical. Or if someone said, well, he was wrong in suspending habeas corpus during the war between the states in the 19th century. Well, that's more of a political slash moral question. So different kinds of claims have different protocols and methods and procedures to demonstrate it to be true or false, right?
Hmm.
And so that if you believe it on the basis of the demonstration, then that said you hold something by reason. In contrast, faith is believing something on the basis of authority. Now, there's a couple of things to not miss about this. If somebody asked me, well, Richard, do you believe that Fermat's last theorem is true? I'd say yes. Well, have you seen the demonstration? Well, not really. I've seen that there is a demonstration, but I can't get past the first line of the demonstration before I'm lost, right? Well, how do you know it's true? Well, I trust Andrew Wiles. Well, here's the thing that people miss about faith and its relationship to reason. I would have to know enough about Andrew Wiles by reason to know that he's worth trusting in those areas that I can't assess the demonstration on my own. In other words, I just didn't believe any Yahoo that came along and told me anything about Fermat's last theorem. Reason was able to judge, well, no, Andrew Wiles is a bona fide mathematician. His demonstration was vetted by peer review mathematicians around the world. And so I would be a fool not to believe that it's true, but it's not because I believe it by reason, namely, I didn't see the demonstration. I believe it on the authority of legitimate authorities. So reason judges when authorities are legit and when you don't have access to it. So let's map that then on top of the question that really matters to us, and that is we generally don't use the word faith if somebody said, well, I believe Andrew Wiles because he's a mathematician. I probably wouldn't say, well, I have faith in Andrew. Well, I probably wouldn't use that term in English, but that's kind of what I'm meaning. I'm trusting him when he tells me, right? But what about things that are of eternal import? Here's something I would love to ask an atheist sometime if I get a chance. Uh, if there really was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Father of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, if that really was true, I know you don't believe it, Mr. Atheist, but let's say that it was true. And then second, let's suppose he did give us his book that is inerrant and infallible. I know you don't believe that, but let's just say for the sake of argument that he did. Then am I a fool for believing what a book tells me when I believe that that book was given to me by an all-loving, omniscient, omnipotent God? And I would like to think the atheist would go, well, no, I mean, in that situation, you'd be a fool not to believe it. Okay. Now, it still tells me things I can't verify by any kind of demonstration. I can't prove I'm going to rise from the dead. But Jesus says in John 5, he's going to raise everyone from the dead. And those who have done good unto the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil unto the resurrection of condemnation. And I know some hearers may go, well, wait a minute, I thought we weren't saved by doing good. In the very next chapter, John, when his detractors perhaps were asking him, what must we do to do the works of God? He said, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent, which he's talking about himself. So we trust God when he tells us that he pays for our sins through his son on the cross, raised him from the dead to vindicate that, and then he'll give us the gift of eternal life if we trust him for it. So I've got to decide whether I'm going to take him at his word. So what gets missed, I think, in a lot of contemporary debates about faith and reason, particularly among skeptics like the atheists, is it's probably not entirely their fault in that they might actually meet Christians that are this way in the marketplace. Right. But they should do the due diligence, say, what are the best that Christians have thought? Faith just isn't just believing something when common sense tells you not to, or just a leap into the dark. It's trusting an authority, but that authority is demonstrated to be authority that you can know by reason, or at least can. You know, you might still not, but at least you can. And that's the distinction that's very explicit in Aquinas when he makes that. So we believe things that are assented to by someone else that we couldn't basically have access to on our own. And that's what we mean when we say we have faith and trust what God tells us in his word about our eternal destiny, for example.
Yeah, and I think Aquinas also had some classic arguments for the existence of God that we still use to this day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, tell us about.
So it's interesting because pretty much any kind of introductory text to philosophy, at least in most American universities that I'm familiar with. Now, it may be different in other places in the world, but at least here in the U.S. and probably in Anglo-American philosophy departments, they all have their obligatory, mention of Aquinas. Just like most of the luminaries from philosophical history, they get a little space as you go through the history of ideas and stuff. So Aquinas always has his. Well, in virtually every instance that I've ever encountered, both as a student and a professor in philosophy, the one thing that gets mentioned in Aquinas is his arguments for God's existence. If nothing else is said, at least those get in. Mm-hmm. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is that's probably the most important question, whether people will admit it or not, is does God exist? But it's also it's convenient to list them because they're the ones that he give. There are 5 just laconic, pithy little arguments that you could write out on a single page. So it's like, well, if we're going to mention anything, first of all, that's probably one of the most interesting things. And second, it's one of the easiest because I can just give it in a couple of column inches in my book and move on and stuff. So that became known as his 5 ways. There were 5 arguments for the existence of God. And Patrick, when I did my dissertation at the University of Arkansas, I did my dissertation on the second of those 5 ways, what is called efficient causality, which people would probably more commonly refer to it as a cosmological argument. One of the things I discovered in my doctoral research was how seldom commentators on the 5 ways didn't consider the philosophical context in which he gave those 5 ways, whatever that philosophical context is. And so I found about maybe half or more of the resources that when I was looking for this, just totally misunderstood his arguments because they didn't consider what those arguments meant in the context of his
Mm,
broader philosophical view, which he obviously, well, I started to say obviously, maybe it's not obvious unless someone's actually seen it. These 5 ways are given right at the beginning of his big multi-volume magnum opus called the Summa Theologia. They're right at the very beginning. So obviously, he hasn't spent any time on background assumptions and terminological definitions and yeah, all that. He didn't because he just, it's like the second thing he brings up. He starts talking about God's existence and then he's off to the races.
mm,
So it's understandable, I suppose, for some people when they read it so early on in this magnum that they figure they can just take arguments at face value. And I would submit to your viewers and hearers that that can be a fatal mistake. That is fatal in the sense you're going to drastically misunderstand the argument
mm,
if you don't already know what he obviously assumed his readers already knew in the 13th century. That is, everybody knew Aristotle. Everybody knew Aristotle's 4 causes, so that when he talks about efficient cause, he doesn't have to define that. And
mm.
so what I argued, among other things in my dissertation, was, okay, so it's undoubtedly he's assuming everybody knows what efficient causality means, though he doesn't define it. He just figures, well, nobody doesn't know Aristotle, do they? I thought if that's true, then might it be the case that there are other assumptions that he's playing off of and really serve as the context that he doesn't define that might make a difference in how things are understood. And that's what one of the things I argue. And one of those assumptions is his concept of existence. And unless somebody understood what he already thought about what it meant to exist, then to argue for God's existence ultimately won't really have a lot of content. It just kind of seemingly doesn't get you many places. But here's the thing to notice. I'll end with this part. If where that comes in his 5 pithy little arguments that he gives is at the front end. What happens as soon as he gives those arguments is then an inexorable cascade of all of these classical attributes of God. Starts with simplicity and then goodness, omnipotence, omniscience. They're just downstream from that. And they all stem from that basic starting point on his metaphysics, that the God that he's proving exists is not just like Thor or Zeus or Hermes or any number of gods that people might run into in the Greek pantheon. It's not just some thing out there that we could argue does or does it not exist, like we might argue about UFOs as we're arguing today, or does Santa Claus exist? And you could have all these arguments, and then God comes along. Well, what about God? Does he exist? And some people give these arguments, go, yeah, but when we're talking about God, we're talking about something that's unique because we're talking about an infinite being whose very essence is to exist and gives existence to all creation. That's what we mean, at least. So that's what he does. And so the first one is called the argument from motion. I lied to you. I told you I'd end with that thought, but just to kind of answer your question. His first one was the argument from motion. Unfortunate English translation. The better word would be change. So when you see a leaf go from green to brown, as Stevie Wonder would have said in his inner visions, I don't know if leaves go to green to brown in some places in the world, but they do in the Southeast U.S. That's called motion in Aristotle. Even though the leaf didn't move, it's not locomotion. It just means change. So you got the argument from motion, the argument from efficient causality, the argument from necessary being, the argument from the graduation of perfection, and the argument from teleology are his 5 ways in question 2 of his Summa Theologia, part 1, question 2.
Yes, and another one pillar you mentioned was, his understanding of natural law, which was a tremendous influence later on philosophical and legal traditions. So tell us about the natural law and how that really influenced culture. And you mentioned how much it influenced, the writing of the Declaration and the
Absolutely.
Constitution here in the United States.
Absolutely. What a sad commentary it is on the progress or deterioration of jurisprudence in the United States when you go from the Declaration of Independence
Mm-hmm.
to when Clarence Thomas was going through his Senate confirmation hearings. Lawrence Tribe, who was professor of constitutional law at Harvard University, and actually wrote and consulted for constitutions in other countries in the world as they're formulating constitutions. He wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times. People old enough, maybe my age, might remember those confirmation hearings, and they were fraught with a lot of controversy and scandal. But probably what most people think they remember were these allegations of sexual misconduct at an earlier government appointment when he was Solicitor General, and the Anita Hill and all those kind of. Lawrence Tribe, though, no fan of Clarence Thomas, in his op-ed said, no, you know what the real controversy was, what got the senators all in a tizzy was the fact that at some point Clarence Thomas said he held the natural law.
Yeah.
And I just go, okay, so all these guys break out in a rash when a potential Supreme Court justice believes in natural law theory, when natural law was our birth.
Right.
That was our birth certificate as Americans. They go, wow, how did we get there? The key, I think, with respect to natural law and morality and human morality is the notion of teleology. So teleology is this idea that given what a thing is, its whatness would be its essence. Given what something is, then it possesses these capacities, or Aristotle's word would be potencies, but these capacities to change in a certain direction towards a certain goal. So a papaya seed is not going to become a whale, no matter how long and you let it's never ever able to become anything other than a papaya tree. That's it. Now it might fail to do that if it's burned in a fire or eaten by an animal. It might fail, but left to its own devices, it will inevitably become a full-grown, healthy papaya tree, and that's what it will do. But why? Because it has this nature, its whatness, its essence that sets it on this trajectory. Well, in Aristotle and then Aquinas later on, any natural object, so we're not talking about artifacts like a cell phone, for example, or a laptop, but any natural object, a dog, a tree, whatever, has a teleology by virtue of its essence and nature. So what constitutes the good of that thing is when it fulfills its sort of purpose, its sort of goal, it reaches that goal that's completely filled. And by the way, just to interrupt myself, one important thing I think for people to bear in mind is when we start having these discussions here about natural law, one of the first things I do when I talk about this subject is to alert the audience. You've got to understand the difference between good and moral good. Mm-hmm. Typically, in my experience, in just conversations, when people use the categories good and evil, they almost always mean moral good, unless it's obvious. Like if they say, well, this pineapple here tastes good, we don't mean it tastes morally good. That doesn't make any sense. What we mean by this pineapple tastes good is that it ought to taste by virtue of being a pineapple. A good knife has the characteristics that it ought to have, not a moral ought, but that it ought to have by virtue of being a knife. It wouldn't make sense for somebody to go, well, that's not a very good knife you're trying to sell me. And I go, well, why do you say that? Well, the blade's all dull and pitted and stuff. And, I said, well, what do you think? Well, I think the knife ought to have a sharp blade. It wouldn't make any sense for me to go, well, who are you to say that a knife ought to have a sharp blade? You're trying to impose your morality on me? You go, no, that's just what it is to be a knife, is to have a sharp blade. It's a bad knife when it has a dull blade. It's a good knife when it has a sharp blade. So if you take that kind of talk and you talk about, well, what is a good, and then fill in the blank of anything that's a natural object. What's a good horse? What's a good lion? What's a good tree? What's a good dog? In every instance, you're basically meaning it has all of its capacities that it ought to have by virtue of the kind of thing that it is. Here is where the story then gets very interesting, because not only in Aristotle, but also in Aquinas and other thinkers as well, there's something different about human beings among all animals. And that is that human beings have rationality and free will. And not free will necessarily in the sense in which Calvinists and Arminians debate that. They're connected, but they're not exactly the same. This is more of a philosophical notion. I think there's a way to define this that's relatively indifferent to that theological debate in Romans 9 and stuff. What you mean by free will is that a human being has the capacity to deliberate among competing goods, some of which goes against what it is to be a human being. A lion will never not act like a lion unless it's sick or injured. It never won't be a lion. It doesn't identify as a cheetah, whatever, right? But
Hmm.
a human can act in a way that detracts from what it is to be a good human being. Now, people may go, well, wait a minute. You're sneaking something in here because who are you to say what a good human being is? And my first reaction to that is, well, first of all, this isn't the first time we've had this conversation as human beings. We've been talking about what is it to be a human being for thousands and thousands of years. And
Yeah.
people would be startled to see a fairly unified picture of what a good human is. It's a person who's kind, it's a person who's faithful, keeps his promises, doesn't hurt other people. You just go down this list, everybody recognizes that as a good human. So what makes it moral when we do it is precisely because we have the capacity to not do it or work against that. No other creature on the planet, sensible creatures like a lion or whatever, they don't have that capacity to do anything but what their instinct makes them. But humans are, what to use Aquinas' term, we're provident over our own life. And so we're strapped with this responsibility to try to find out, well, what is it to be a good human and not, and follow a certain trajectory. And we run the risk of doing violence to that. And that's what makes something moral, is that we have that choice. That's why, if some of your viewers and listeners might have already thought this about Aquinas, that's why Aquinas would say, well, God's not a moral being. And people understandably go, well, wait a minute, what? I thought it says God is good. And so, yeah, but what Aquinas means by that is God doesn't have a teleology such that he's trying to be all he can be. And hopefully someday he'll get there. What we're saying is he's the he's the infinite standard of goodness because he's infinite being itself, to which all my finite being is just trying to approach. As I have a capacity as a zygote in the womb and eventually become a full mature adult, the difference between that zygote and that adult is the amount of being that it took on, that all those potencies become actual. And so that whole thing, then, to the degree that those fall within my will to choose, I mean, I don't choose to digest or to go bald, or something that those aren't, but I do choose how to treat my wife or how to treat my friends or how to keep my promises. I do have a responsibility to choose that. So this natural law theory, Aquinas would argue it's the way God can manage nation states, if you will, in terms of peaceful coexistence, where we can recognize maybe the best way to get along with other nations is not conquer them and take all their stuff, which is what most nations did for most of the history of the world, right? But say, how about we have diplomacy? How about if we have, how about we try to, try to get along with borders and our language and stuff and peacefully coexist. And by the way, not to open up a can of worms on a totally different subject, but just to throw this out for people to consider, Robert Riley's book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, has a great expose of when the Christians in the Middle Ages and the Muslims in the Middle Ages were grappling with how do we understand the relationship of faith and reason. That Christianity, by and large, chose, hey, there's a mutually supportive role that they play, and it opened up Christian Europe to new ideas in science. We went from the Ptolemy to the Copernican model to new ideas in government, like diplomatic relations rather than warfare, new ideas in economics. Instead of feudalism, we had more of an entrepreneurial and private property. Christian Europe was open to these things because they settled that issue rightly. Whereas Sunni Islam basically said it's the absolute will of Allah. End of the story. Don't question it. Don't try to do apologists do that. And it arrested Muslim development, who, a lot of ways, Muslims were the vanguard of societal progress, especially in the Iberian Peninsula and that period. But it got arrested, and now we're fighting ISIS and stuff because they're still behaving the way most nations behave. Conquer your neighbors and take their stuff. That's what I mean, I'm laughing because it's just so obvious. But Briley argues all this boiled down to this idea of faith and reason, and then its ability to open the door to natural law theory, where we could understand moral truths that are objectively true, irrespective of our religion and our language and stuff. So
Hmm.
it's gone away in American jurisprudence for the most part. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school, but from people that I talked to and read, it's almost non-existent there. And I think it's a shame in a way because this legal positivism that whatever is right is just what the law says. I don't know, man. I mean, the law used to say slavery was okay.
Hmm.
And how did we come to terms with the fact that it's not okay? Because there were moral truths that were objective, irrespective of what individual governments prescribed. And so that whole theater of discussion is all the natural law concepts.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned, Islam, and something a lot of people may not know is that Aquinas was a great evangelist to the Muslim world. He wrote one of the best defenses against the challenge of Islam. Dr. Geisler said, I believe it was Charles Martel who militarily defeated the advance of Islam overtaking Europe, and it's Aquinas who intellectually defeated Islam. Tell us
Yes.
about
Yeah.
how he did that.
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned the Summa Theologia, which is his magnum opus. It's about 6 volumes in English translation. But whether that's the most important or not, certainly a close second would be his Summa Contra Gentiles. And basically, what that is a manual of apologetics for Christian missionaries. Almost inevitably, they're going to go up against Muslims in their spread of the Christian message. So he meticulously lays out the distinctives of Christianity. Now, there are some things that Muslims and Christians might have agreed on to some extent in terms of, let's say, the correspondence theory of truth, although that one was up for grabs in some Muslim quarters. So it depends on who you ask. But obviously the differences are the differences that make all the difference, right? And that's the distinctives of Christianity: the Trinity, the deity of Jesus as God in the flesh, his resurrection, well, his death on the cross, which Muslims deny, and his resurrection from the dead. Of course, if you didn't die on the cross, the resurrection wouldn't even make sense to the Muslims and stuff. So he meticulously lays out. And the thing about the Summa Contra Gentiles, in contrast to, say, the Summa Theologia, at least in my experience, is it's a much easier read. Personally, it's shorter, and it's even though it's 5 volumes and it's fairly modest sized paperback. I actually worked out a matrix, and I'm a very slow reader. I think God's kept me a slow reader just to be an encouragement to students who worry about the fact that they might be a slow reader. So maybe I shouldn't do apologetics or philosophy. I go, I've got a PhD in somehow pull that off, and I'm a slow reader. Okay,
So am I.
you just have to make the time out to do it. So I worked out a matrix one year to just how much would I need to read every day to get through the Summa Contra Gentiles in a year, and it was a fairly modest amount of reading, and it's divided up in these sections that are very accessible. So I would encourage your viewers and hearers to consider maybe sitting down with the Summa Contra Gentiles, because you get into some of the same issues because it's the Christian worldview, if I may use that term. It's still that he does in the Summa. He just doesn't cover as many open-ended questions that need to be settled as he does in the Summa Theologia, which, that there's pretty much no stone left unturned in that work. Okay. But the Summa Contra Gentiles is a great, great read to just go through on issues: existence of God, the attributes of God, and the distinctives of Christianity with respect to the deity of Christ and his crucifixion and his resurrection. So yeah, good read. Summa Contra Gentiles is what is most commonly called in English translation.
Yes, you've been listening to Dr. Richard Howe, professor of philosophy and apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary. We've been talking about one of the great apologists and theologians and philosophers of Christian, but also Western history, the great Thomas Aquinas. Well, Richard, as we bring this to a close, if people want to get a good understanding or introduction to Thomas Aquinas, they're a little intimidated by his works, where can they start?
So the first thing that comes to mind is Geisler's book, Thomas Aquinas, An Evangelical Appraisal. Now, the challenge there is the book is technically out of print, so you still might find it, however, in the used book market. I've heard rumblings that the Norman Geisler International Ministries is going to publish his second edition of that. But I haven't I haven't heard lately where that's at. So keep on the lookout for that. Another source that I think is great is a Catholic philosopher that I really admire named Edward Feser. When you see it, it looks like Fesser, F-E-S-E-R, but it's pronounced phaser, like the weapon in Star Trek. Edward Feser, and it's a book just titled Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. It's actually a series of small books on this beginner's guide series. And Feser actually wrote the one on Aquinas. He wrote the one on John Locke, and he wrote the one on the philosophy of mind. So I think he's just a tremendous writer and putting the cookies on the bottom shelf. But when you need him to, he can just get as technical as you want. And that one, though, in his little Aquinas book, it's a great summary of Aquinas' thought. So those two things right there, I think, are a great place to start to try to get your feet under you regarding the thinking of Aquinas.
Yes, and also some courses at Southern Evangelical be a great place to start. Tell us
Of
about,
course, absolutely.
yes, tell us about
That's right.
Southern.
So ses.edu, Southern Evangelical Seminary, we're top heavy in apologetics and philosophy. This is what Geisler's DNA is. We realize how integral it is to sound theology, particularly existence and attributes of God. A sound philosophy actually is. So our philosophical orientation is unashamedly classical or Thomistic, okay, in terms of its Protestant version, not the theology of Aquinas necessarily, although the theology would comport as well. So ses.edu, we offer classes for degree or non-degree, even audit. For pennies on the dollar, you can get audit. We've implemented some time ago a kind of, I think they call it an equal sacrifice policy. What we try to do is students from other nations try to modify the tuition cost.
Oh,
Their exchange rate kind of thing. What would this many American dollars in the U.S. mean and that many this monetary unit in that country? And it makes it more affordable for many countries in the world. If a person is, and we do everything, pretty much everything through Zoom. Some classes are live stream. Some classes are what we call asynchronous, which means they're pre-recorded. But even the pre-recorded classes, you still have access to the professors through Zoom. I'm doing a class right now on Thursday nights on atheism. So we got all different kinds of formats. And we offer not only a bachelor's degree in religion, but we offer a master's in apologetics, a master's in philosophy, a doctorate of ministry, which is a lot of luminaries around the world have those degrees, and then a PhD in philosophy of religion. So if you go to ses.edu, you can get a catalog there. You can get me anytime, or Howe at ses.edu, just my first initial, last name. If I can do anything for you, answer any questions, I'm happy to do that. And then if you want as well, the website that my wife Rebecca and I have is richardghowe.com. I told somebody that in a moment of humility, I bought and named a domain on the internet after myself. That's how humble I was. So richardghowe.com. I'm not a web developer. It's a pretty cheesy, static website, but I think the links all work. And I've got tons of resources there that you can get for free, and from anything from multimedia to PDF files and stuff. So I invite you to check that out as well.
yes, thank you very much. Yes, you've been listening to our interview with Dr. Richard Howe, the Norman Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics there at Southern Evangelical, Professor of Philosophy and Apologetics. So, Richard, thanks again for being a guest here on
Thanks,
FL
Patrick.
Answers.